So in our very neurophysiology of color vision, when we're seeing something that's orange, there are alternative possibilities of activation of that system, which would deliver alternative forms of experience, the experience of red or the experience of yellow. And so I think that kind of strange and unbelievable modal structure in the world that Aristotelian color out in the world would require is actually matched by a sort of very plausible and actual form of structure in our neurophysiology.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Joseph Mendola. He is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. His work covers a range of topics, including ethics, metaphysics, and mind. He has several books, including Human Thought, Goodness and Justice, A Consequentialist Moral Theory, Anti-Externalism, Human Interests or Ethics for Physicalists, Experience and Possibility, and his most recent book, The Neural Structure of Consciousness. And that last book is going to be our focus for today. But yeah, feel free to add anything. But with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Mendola.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So yeah, this is a really interesting topic. As I said, we're going to be covering your recent book on the neural structure of consciousness. And I'll include links to where people can find this book, OUP or Amazon or whatever. But just to start, I mean, can you give a bit of an overview of the main problems of consciousness that you face in this book, and in particular, like the so-called hard problem?
Oh, sure. So it's intuitive to say, I think most people would say, it's like something to be you and me, and though it's more controversial, a squirrel and a dog, but it's not like anything to be like a refrigerator or a chair, something like that. And so that issue about what it's like to be something is sort of the heart of the so-called hard problem of consciousness. I'm particularly interested in this book on a sort of subset of that problem, having to do with what it's like to have sensory experiences of certain kinds. So, we see things, we hear things, and as we see things and hear things, things are presented to us in a certain sort of way. And as time has gone on, it's become relatively clear that there's a kind of a mismatch between the way things seem to be in our experience of them, how we see them to be, how we hear them to be, and any sort of objective correlate of those things that we see and hear out in the world. And Aristotle thought the world was pretty much the way we see it to be. He thought color, much as we see it to be, was spread around in the objects, and it's like we're a hole into which the color of the objects falls when we see the colors of things. But as time's gone on, it seems to be more plausible to think things are constituted, most things that we observe are constituted out of the sorts of colorless entities that our physics talks about. And yet we see them to have colors. I mean, maybe there are something we might be prepared to call colors in the world, something like the way the surfaces of the objects reflect and refract light. But there's a kind of a mismatch between our sensory experience, as it seems to us, what it's like to see colors, and any objective correlate out on the object. Just to give an example of that from the case of color, many examples. Obviously, colorblind people plausibly have a different experience of the colors of objects than we do, even though they're looking at the same world. Some purplish blues seem in our experience quite similar to some reds, but they correspond to very, very different sorts of surface spectral reflectances and wavelengths of light. There are in our experience the so-called unique hues. So there's a kind of a red that's neither orangish nor purplish, the unique red. And even color normal people, that is to say people who aren't colorblind, it turns out see different wavelengths of light as unique red. And this seems to reflect differences in their neurophysiology of color vision and not in anything in the world. So there seems to be this gap between what it's like for us to sense things and the objects out in the world that we're sensing. And that's the sort of problem that I try to focus on in this book.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, did you want to add more to that?
And there's a number of standard views about how to solve this difficulty, the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And one standard sort of answer that now has popularity is some sort of dualism. That is to say that on top of our neurophysiological and physical nature, we somehow are constituted by these spiritual ghostly substances in which the color resides, or in which our experience of the color resides. And to me, such views are unattractive, just because it seems like there are various difficulties in trying to understand the causal relations there would be between these ghostly substances and our physical aspects. And also because it seems implausible that out of the wide world that we seem to be able to understand on the basis of our physics, this very special problem but could not be solved by ordinary physical means. So then there are attempts at more physicalist-friendly solutions, which have some popularity. And most of the current solutions depend on the notion of representation and information. So it's thought that there are neural analogs of words, little neural words, that carry information, are causally correlated with objects in the world, and hence carry information about those things. And though I'm also attracted to physicalist accounts, I don't think these particular accounts are effective in dealing with the problem of what it's like to have sensory experience, simply because there is that gap that we talked about earlier between the way the objects actually are and our experience of them. These causal informational accounts are not particularly well suited to delivering features of our sensory experience which are due to a mismatch between our environment and the world. And so I think another sort of solution is called for. And this book is my attempt to try to develop such an alternative account.
Right. Yeah, very good. So maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the other approaches. Like you mentioned dualism there, mm-hmm. and you talk about a little bit about panpsychism in the book. Maybe starting with dualism, where we think that the mental, the conscious stuff is sort of just a separate thing altogether from anything going on in the brain or any physical stuff. Mm-hmm. Kind of use the word like ghostly stuff, but what do you think about some of the shortcomings, or why you would resist that sort of response to the herd problem?
Okay. Well, there are different ways such a view could be developed. And one sort of view is the epiphenomenal form, which is the form in which the features that are present in the dualist substance or dualist aspect of us don't have any effect on the physical world. One traditional worry about that is that it's extremely unintuitive to think that, for instance, the features of our pain that we feel or the aspects of the color that we experience don't have any effect on our actual behavior in the world. So, but on the other hand, there are pressures for epiphenomenalism. That's called the epiphenomenalist view, if you go a dualist route, because it seems as if there, as far as we see, there aren't the sorts of intervention in the world on the basis of these things outside of the ordinary causal order that you would expect if these dualist features of us had some effect on our behavior and hence on the world. So that's one sort of problem with the dualist solutions. Another sort of problem is just, it would seem like we should have very strong motivation to postulate these special, unusual sorts of metaphysical entities. And the motivation would have to be pretty strong, I think, because it doesn't seem as if they're required to account for other features of the whole vast universe. And there's a certain kind of pride in thinking that, this special magic dust, it has to be present only in our own case when we're such a small part of the universe. There might be such motivations, but I think it would depend on the physicalist solutions being entirely unworkable, and I don't think they are. Did you want me to talk about panpsychism or?
No, yeah. So just on that first, though, yeah, I definitely share that. You seem to suggest that there's kind of almost a sort of presumption in favor of physicalist views, because, like, look, if we could account for what's going on, not just in our environment, but in ourselves and so on, with just the physical stuff, neural and otherwise, like, that would be a better view if we didn't have to invoke this extra, perhaps somewhat mysterious stuff to explain certain phenomena. So, like, maybe, yeah, so you're saying, like, there's sort of a presumption there, and that could be overcome, but
Yes,
maybe
sure.
you don't think it has been. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, panpsychism, like, that's another view that's gained some popularity, I guess, in recent years. So they, on that view, they think roughly that the sort of intrinsic nature of matter is conscious, like, roughly speaking. And so, even though physics doesn't reveal that intrinsic nature, it reveals maybe structural properties, and Philip Goff would say things like this. Nevertheless, the intrinsic nature of the things that satisfy those properties is conscious. Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe what do you think about that?
Again, I mean, such a view would require some strong motivation, because it's essentially saying all the vast universe, including the stars and the rocks, is conscious, and that seems to me to require strong motivation. But there are also certain problems, which, of course, panpsychists are closely aware of. If, for instance, we think that physical entities of various kinds that make up the universe are things like quarks and leptons and curved space-time, the either the intrinsic phenomenal properties or proto-phenomenal properties that they would seem to be constrained by that. So it would seem like, for instance, every electron would have the same phenomenal inside, so to speak. And it's hard to see how those sorts of phenomenal insides of things like electrons and quarks of various kinds could sum up to have the unified and very particular sort of consciousness that we have in our sensory experience of things. Why is it that our experience of the colors of things has exactly the sort of phenomenal detail it has, and our audition has other sorts of phenomenal features, or what it's like features, if indeed they're all constituted by the same kinds of particles, ultimately, the systems which deliver them. And panpsychists recognize this difficulty, but it is a difficulty with the view.
Right. It almost seems like you're going to have to give some story like what certain physicists will try to offer. Like, well, once you have these sorts of things functioning this way, then you get those sorts of experiences.
Yeah.
Well,
to deliver
maybe
to deliver a sort of intuitive sense of our own unified, what it's like experience. Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah. But I think that just thinking about what someone might say in response, like Goff might say something like, on the two issues here, one, maybe I think he would grant that there's a problem there, but, like, maybe that the panpsychist is in a better position to handle it, because at least you have something conscious at the beginning that you're building up into other things. And then on the other point about the sort of presumption, or that they'd have to sort of meet a burden to support the view, I think it would say something like, but this panpsychist view, at least his preferred view, is empirically equivalent to, like, a purely physicalist view, which would deny those intrinsic natures or whatever, because you still have all the same structural properties and so on. So, like, why would there be a presumption if they're empirically equivalent in favor of the physicalist one, or something like that?
I mean, you could. Yeah. I mean, it would be an empirically equivalent theory with an added element, there'd be two empirically equivalent theories, one which has less controversial apparatus. So something like an Occam's razor argument would suggest it would be preferred. But I mean, I think this is an area in which we should let 1,000 flowers bloom. Any view that you're going to come up with is going to have some difficulties that it needs to be faced. I think the combination problem is especially troubling for the panpsychists. So if they could solve that one in a way that I could understand, then I would be more sympathetic, I think, to that alternative. It also, of course, depends on my, the burden of proof is arguments are probably unfortunate and more present in philosophy than they should be. But if indeed there's a physicalist solution that doesn't involve those difficulties, then I think that would be something to prefer. Now, of course, it'll face difficulties of its own that it must overcome. But I think if it were possible to do that, I would still prefer the physicalist alternative to the panpsychist one.
Right, fair. And also, I mean, not to dwell on panpsychism too much, but one worry that I have is that some people talk about how maybe it's unintuitive to talk about brains and such be conscious. But however unintuitive that is, I find it much more unintuitive that like a single electron is conscious.
Yeah,
that just seems like too simple to be the sort of thing that's a conscious thing. But
yeah, what it's like to be an electron is very hard to conceive. Yes.
All right. So you said that you're partial to physicalist views. Maybe we should talk a little bit, or start introducing your preferred approach. We should call the modalized up and down and in details, MOUDD theory. So we'll get into more details, of course, but maybe you could start with a bit of an overview. And what is this about?
Okay. I guess it really has three main sort of components, and I'm going to start with the third component, actually, as it's articulated in the book. So the idea is, the basic idea of the book is the experience we have of, for instance, colors, presents us colors that seem to have a certain kind of modal structure. And by that I mean, say we see something that's orange, a reddy orange, that property of a reddish orange that we see. It seems to me that it's of the essence of that property that we see, that it has a certain kind of relation to red, to pure red, and to yellow. And it's hard to understand if such properties are really out there in the world, which I don't actually think they are, but if the world were the way Aristotle conceived it to be and such properties are out there in the objects, it seems like we'd have to somehow account for their essential nature in a way. And it's a little hard to see how that could be done, because it seems as if there could be a world with orange things in it and no red things or yellow things in it. I mean, in fact, that isn't so, but it would seem like you could have an orange thing without a yellow thing or red thing anywhere. And so it would seem as if somehow we'd have to deliver the essential relations of the orange in a different way. One way we could do it is if we thought Plato was right and there were these uninstantiated forms of, for instance, red that weren't found in the world, but to which the orange property could have some essential relation. And a sort of variant that I favor would suggest in such a world, rather, there would be subsisting, not really existing, but subsisting properties of the same nature with which its essential similarities could be had. It's all probably pretty implausible, but I think that's the kind of structure of the actual world that we'd have to have if there were color of the kind that we seem to see in it. And what I think is the key to understanding how we have the experience of such color, even when there is no such color in the world, is that our neurophysiology of color vision exhibits an analogous kind of structure, modal structure, to the colors we hence see through the constitution of that, by the constitution of that neural structure. So there plausibly are neural systems that are organized in an opponent way, so that there's a red-green opponent system that seems to be sensitive to the difference between red and green, and a yellow-blue system that seems to be sensitive to the difference between blue and yellow. And it seems as if we see things as orange when the yellow-blue system is tipped toward yellow and the red-green system is tipped toward red. And so in our very neurophysiology of color vision, when we're seeing something that's orange, there are alternative possibilities of activation of that system, which would deliver alternative forms of experience, the experience of red or the experience of yellow. And so I think that kind of strange and unbelievable modal structure in the world that Aristotelian color out in the world would require is actually matched by a sort of very plausible and actual form of structure in our neurophysiology. So that's one element of the account. The idea is we look at some of the details of the properties we seem to sense, of what it's like to sense various properties, and we look to see ways in which they reflect structure in our neurophysiology of sensation. So that's really the third element of the view. The other two elements are first, it seems to, I mean, it's possible that there are forms of phenomenal consciousness much unlike our own, but it seems like the cases we're most certain of are our own and of other animals. And so it seems to me we should start out presuming that if we are looking for the locus of consciousness, we should focus on animals like us who are agents, that is to say, who respond in various ways to objective features in the world through sensation and act in various ways into the world. And in particular, living agents who metabolize and expend energy and so forth, and also who do this through the mediation of living cells that are neurons, who have a sort of complex neural structure that mediates between our sensation and our action. And it seems to me if we pay attention to some of the complexities of that neural structure, we can see that it's not well captured by some standard philosophical models. But anyway, that's the first component. Living animals like us with neurons have a certain kind of central role, I think, in understanding our consciousness, because it's the fact that we are living animals with neurons, I think, that goes part way to explaining how we are conscious in the relevant way. And then the other of the three components, the second component, maybe it might be the most, maybe that's the most controversial actually. And when I've developed it in a rather simple, crude way, and maybe more sophistication is required. But basically the idea of that component is this. I'm what's called an internalist in philosophy of mind. That is, I think, the contents of our sensations and thoughts are constituted by states internal to us, internal to our skin. I believe that the crude way to put it is the entirety of our neural structure that mediates between our sensation and action helps to constitute our consciousness. If you have a view like the view that focuses on representation by an information as the locus of consciousness, you're going to think they're fairly particular elements of the brain that have the right sorts of contents to be conscious sensations. But I think basically the whole structure is relevant to our consciousness, so that there's a kind of match between the complex modal structure, what I call modal structure, of our entire neurophysiology and the complex modal structure of our consciousness. And so there are various qualifications to that are required. Obviously, the nervous system does things other than just mediate between our sensation and our action, and it's quite clear that when our neural resources are such that if we have alternative forms of sensory stimulation to the ones we actually have, we'd have a different form of phenomenal consciousness, of sensory consciousness, of what it's like consciousness. And so the whole brain model has to be qualified in certain ways, but that's the basic idea.
All right, yeah. So it gets a bit complicated. So like
Yes.
maybe to start off, like when we talk about modal structure of like neurophysiology and so on, I mean that has to, broadly modality has to do with possibility and necessity. Just letting the audience know if they aren't familiar. So maybe just first, like what in what way does the neurophysiology have a modal structure? Just to begin,
Okay.
like what?
Yeah, and
maybe some of that.
it has in a sort of very realistic way, I think, that doesn't require the kind of subsistence or transcendental platonic universals that I was talking about before. So our color vision, let's say our neurophysiology of color vision is relatively fixed, except for certain states of activation of certain neurons. It's sort of a simplified model in that structure. There's a sort of fixed background structure of the neurons, and then they can be activated in different patterns. So there's two layers present there. There's the sort of fixed background, and then there's the more unstable patterns of activation, which could be different. So if we're in an actual state that involves both the fixed background of the neurons being a certain way and one pattern of activation, there's a sort of real possibility of alternative forms of activation in that same fixed background. And that's a kind of modal structure present in the neural structure. And it doesn't require anything, metaphysically fancy to deliver that. It's just that there are layers of stable and less stable structure in the neurophysiology. And so the idea is to try to mirror the apparent essential modal features of our what it's like of our sensory experience with these more realistic, actual modal structures of alternatives present in our neurophysiology.
Right. Okay. Good. So, like, we could just understand in terms of the modal structure of the neurophysiology. Okay, there's just a general structure to things going on in the nervous system and related structures, and there's different, more specific things that they could be doing. Different firings and so on, and we can think about those different things that it could be doing as well. Those are the various possibilities given that background structure. Yeah, a stable background.
Right, if we're in the state of activation that involves seeing orange, there'd be another possible state of activation that would be our seeing yellow and our seeing red. And the fact that the neurons are capable of those alternative forms of activation is, I think, crucial to the experience even of the orange.
Right. And okay, just a sort of slightly technical question about the modal structure here. Like, I mean, you talk about how the state of the nervous system at any moment isn't defined just by what's actually happening, right? So,
correct.
What's like a neuron firing at some occasion or whatever. But as we say, like what could happen given like the stable background. But I was thinking, doesn't this sort of depend on how we're characterizing the state of the nervous system? Like, I mean, in principle, I could characterize it with a like complete description of each neuron and so on. And it's not clear that on that description you get the relevant modal structure. So, I mean, do you see what I'm getting at there? Or
yes.
Like, what do you think?
Sure. So there has to be there's another problem that comes from the other direction. I mean, presumably it would be possible, to add to your neural structure some kind of complex mechanism that we don't have available, even a dualist substance, even if dualist substance don't exist. And so there has to be some sort of realistic constraint on the nature of the possibilities, and they have to be grounded in the actual physical structure of the neurons. So it has to be the case that there are alternative patterns of firing, which, as a matter of fact, the neural structure relevantly capable of. And so if you're worried that you can rule those out by description, what that means is, I would say, is you're focusing on aspects of the neural structure that are at different levels, but treating them as at one level. So but on the other hand, the level structure that I've talked about is sort of the simplest form of modal structure. So there are commitments to there being real facts, really physically rooted facts about the objective modal structure of the neurophysiology, which rules out the kind of descriptions you're talking about as capturing what's really there, which would be in effect to say all the features of the neurons are essential to them in the relevant sense. And that's a controversial aspect of the view. But it's not unintuitive to say there are facts about what certain machines are capable of and what they're not capable of that are not mind dependent. They're just facts about the way the structures operate, and it'll involve a different sort of various levels of certain things are fixed, other things are not fixed. And I think, though our neurons aren't a lot like machines, they're very much more complex and unstable in various ways. I think analogous things can be said about our neural structure.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess what I was thinking is that, well, there's different ways or different things we might even mean by neural structure or neurophysiology, and like, on some of them you get these modal structural facts, and on other ones you don't, or you get different ones, and it's like, maybe that's not a concern. It's just you're just saying that, okay, for this characterization you have this modal structure, and then in the same way that we have a certain characterization of our phenomenal states, and those have
you could work backwards. I mean, trying to find from the features of the sensory properties the sorts of modal structures which you think need to be present and I don't think that's totally cheating if they're in fact there. But I want to grant that there's some difficulty in understanding what the details of the modal structures in the neurophysiology are, the relevant kinds, and even in characterizing what kinds of modal structures there are possible. I'd like to have a general theory of modal structure which I could apply to lots of different cases, and I don't have such a theory. But it does seem that there are these analogs in structure between the apparent features of the properties that we seem to experience and the actual neurophysiology.
Right. Yes. So on that, of course, we have the modal structure of the neurophysiology, and then there's a similar modal structure to the phenomenal experience. And you want to say that actually they're the same. They have the same. Those modal structures are identical. So maybe you can talk a bit about that identity there. And
yeah, it depends. The fact that the neurophysiology is vision, for instance, of color vision, is embedded in a living animal, and the entire nervous system matters, I think. But if we're talking about the specific features of our neurophysiology that underlie our various forms of experience, I think the fact that orange, the experience of orange, for instance, is experience of something which is essentially related to, if it exists, to red, requires that any creature capable of seeing the orange also be capable of seeing the red in some way, rooted in the real possibilities of their neurophysiology of color vision. So I mean, there's probably limits to this. Probably it doesn't seem extremely intuitive to claim that to be capable of black and white vision, you'd have to be capable of chromatic vision, color vision of the kind that we have. And yet we can see darker and lighter reds. But it seems to me, if we're talking about colors, chromatic colors such as red, blue, green, and yellow, and the there are reasons to think our experience of each of them is sort of modulated by our capacity to experience the others. So I think there could not be someone who can experience red who would not be capable of experiencing green, for instance. This is not to say there couldn't be like a sense data that was red that was independent of a sense data that was green, but just given, if we assume that our vision is constituted by neurophysiology, we're only dealing with creatures who don't have a dualist substance and don't have other sorts of unusual resources involved, panpsychist resources involved. I think the only way you could have a creature who could see red is one who could also see green. And so there's a link in the experience, and what gives us a capacity for our experience, which is related to links in the essences of the properties.
Right. So just at a high level, then, this is it's a kind of type identity theory, right?
It is. There's a question about what level of detail of the neurophysiology matters, and if very, very, very fine details of the neurophysiology matter, it's a type identity theory that's very, very constrained. But I don't think that that's likely. I think there's at least some level of neural detail that's probably not crucial to the constitution of our experience of one color rather than another. But I don't know how, what that level of detail is. So yes, it is a kind of type theory.
Right. But there may need to be some qualifications there, but broadly that's, and then so you would agree that the like a on the token level, but like a token experience like of pain or whatever is identical to some neural events or something like that.
It's going to be it's not going to be some particular neural event. It's going to require the vast complexities of our neurophysiology will constitute all at once all the particular experiences we're having. But yes, there will be a token identity in that kind of case.
Right. Good. And I did want to bring up a couple worries there, but maybe first I had a question because you talked earlier about how, in addition to neurophysiology, you talked about life and agency are also important. Maybe you could expand on this a little bit, because I was wondering, like, what would you say about people like imagine a kind of Boltzmann brain thought experiment where the brain just kind of fluctuates into existence and just happens to have the same neural firings or whatever as a ordinary brain. Like, is that ruled out on your approach, or what do you think about that?
If the Boltzmann brain, when it formed itself out of the chaos, was a living, embedded in a living animal, then I would say yes. Though the history I don't think matters, how it got to where it did. So I don't think evolutionary history matters. I don't think any history matters. I think the current state but I do think it requires more than just the brain, and I think it requires more than some informationally similar analog of the brain. But yes, I think if it were suitably concrete, I think it would be capable of the relevant consciousness. Yes.
Okay, but like suppose it's just maybe a brain, but maybe a little bit more of the nervous system or whatever we think is, like, presumably the whole organism wouldn't be required. So like it doesn't need to have hands, for example, or maybe so like that would still qualify, you think, so long as
yes. I mean, if we lose our hands, we're still conscious.
Right.
Yes.
Of course.
Yes. I think if we were to lose, I do think that our motor action matters in some cases. And so if we were to lose all our capacity to act, I think that might be problematic in some cases, though, you can act by mental action. But I think it's crucial to the constitution of some of our experience that we have roughly the sorts of motor capacities that we have, which involves our bodies in various ways, but not particular limbs, for instance. And I do think our sensory receptor cells, some of which are in our hands and our bodies, are crucial to the specific form of consciousness we have. But of course, you retain many of those if you lose your hand.
Right. Okay, good. And then I wanted to bring up a couple of worries someone might have for just the posited identity, or the claim that the...
Sure.
So one might be someone, like a dualist might say something like the following: look, I agree that there's like these maybe strong correlations between these structures, but why go beyond that and say that they're actually identical? Yeah, so maybe to start with this one, and then I'll bring up the second
Yeah,
worry.
I mean, if you find a phenomena and then you find a sort of explanation of it that's of the physical kind, it seems to me you need some motivation, given our general understanding of the world and thinking there's a problem. And dualists are motivated by various examples often, which make them think there are crucial problems. They're the famous thought experiments that you can imagine, a creature who is neurophysiologically identical to you, but is a zombie, a philosophical zombie, and it's not like anything to be it. Or there's Mary in the black and white room, who has been raised in the black and white room and learned everything there is to know about the neurophysiology of color vision, but has never seen red. And she goes out of her room and she sees red, and it seems like she learns something about the experience of color by coming out of her room, even though she knew all the physical facts before she left the room. And I think those are interesting and puzzles that have to be confronted. And what I would say about those cases are this, maybe by focusing on the Mary case. I think when Mary comes out of her room, she is able, in a way she wasn't before, absent stimulation, to form new concepts that she was incapable of when she was in the room. She's able to understand what it's like to see red, and she's actually able to understand for the first time what that Aristotelian red that she seems to see when she comes out of the room, what it would be. She forms a concept of that red, and also a concept of what it's like to experience that red, which she didn't have, which I think, when she was in the room. On the other hand, I think what she then does is she forms new concepts of things. In one case, of something that doesn't exist, Aristotelian red, and then she can apply those concepts, at least the concept of the experience of red, to something she had another concept of before, that is to say, a neurophysiological concept of part of her system of color vision. So I think, sort of a standard response, I think that she can form new concepts of things that she was already had some knowledge of before she left the room. And so if we face a bat, let's say we're looking at a bat, another classic example, and let's say we know for some reason that the bat's neurophysiology somehow constitutes their experience. And then we study the neurophysiology of bat sonar and learn all there is to know about the physical facts about bat sonar. We would still not be in position, I think, to know what it's like for the bat to experience things through their sonar. But we would have very strong antecedent reason to think we knew all the facts about what constitutes the bat to have such experience. So I think in looking in from the outside on various creatures, unlike ourselves, we are in a bad epistemic position in the sense that we can't understand some concepts that they have. We aren't able to form those concepts ourselves, but that doesn't show that there are additional facts that we aren't able to understand in our own way. So that's related to standard sort of responses to the Mary case. I think the novelty in my case is I don't think there's any red for Mary to experience when she comes out of the room, but she does have a kind of hallucination or non-veridical experience as of Aristotelian red. It forms a concept of that, even though there's nothing like that in the universe.
Right, but that aside, I mean, broadly, you're suggesting something like the phenomenal concept strategy. Like
it's similar to the phenomenal concept strategy. It's similar to the strategy that your different kind of knowledge, like confrontational knowledge, is required. But yeah, it has very close similarities to standard responses. And the idea is that the form of it is slightly different in application to my view, and my hope is that the strategies are more effective in response to objections to my view. But yes, those are familiar responses for sure.
Yeah, that seems pretty plausible to me. Like just broadly, like okay, you think about Mary in the black and white room, her the sort of tools or conceptual apparatus for describing the physical world is limited to certain physical vocabulary and concepts and so on, and she can talk about those things in those terms. Now there might be other ways in which in principle you could talk about those same things that you wouldn't be able to do in the room.
Sure.
And maybe one of those is with a sort of if you want phenomenal conceptual repertoire that maybe she develops when outside, but not something she already had. But that's not to say that there's something else in the world that wasn't already included in her description or ontology. It was just included in different terms. That's maybe how I would think of it. Does that seem like
that seems right to me? Yes. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of how. Yeah, makes sense. Maybe we'll come back to a couple other challenges to physicalism, but I did say that I wanted to cover a second worry for just the identity at this point, and then I'll maybe come back to some of the other ones. So, yeah, I mean, although I'm not going to get too much into it right now, people have argued that the neurophysiological and the mental structures do have different modal kind of profiles. And, what if someone just, without getting into those arguments specifically, I mean, what if someone just finds it intuitive that you could have the same neurophysiological structure, but just not any phenomenal consciousness, or even a different phenomenal consciousness? People talk about philosophical zombies and inverted quality and other things like that. Yeah. So
if they find it plausible, I think again, if you focus on the case of the invert, for instance, the qualia invert. So the color qualia invert has color experience that's inverted relative to normal experience. Maybe the red and the green are swapped, and there are corresponding differences all around the circle of color similarities. So they have a sort of radically different color experience of the world. And people have argued that we have no particular antecedent reason even to believe, if we're looking at a neurophysiological duplicate of ourselves, that they wouldn't have ours rather than inverted color experience. So that's a sort of especially troubling, aspect of that problem that you've articulated. Not that there aren't others. And there has been work that I've attempted to exploit by people like Larry Hardin that tries to explain ways in which the apparent inversions don't really fit very well with the detailed neurophysiology of our color vision. They involve detailed facts, like the fact that certain colors are more saturated than other colors, or there are browns are related to yellows in a different way that dark reds are related to reds, and so forth. And so you can make arguments that, not that you would know with any certainty, of course, but that if you had to choose what assignment of colors to make to what it's like colors, phenomenal colors to make to a physical duplicate of you, it would be the one that is the same as you've got, rather than the inverted one. That's not to eliminate all the worries about inversions and zombies, of course. Can we conceive zombies? Well, we certainly can say the words. And we could try to refine the sense of what sort of conception is required to make a case for possibility. And I would argue that we aren't in the position to be certain of that possibility. But I think those are much more difficult arguments to make.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to start exploring like Chalmers' 75 different accounts of
the dancing qualia and the fading qualia. I don't think. I mean, I think it's the full zombie thought. I think is very hard for humans to actually sustain if they were presented with actual cases. So if you have like some poor creature rolling around on the, in obvious pain, I think it's very difficult for us to believe that they're a zombie, even though I guess people think that that's a possibility. But that our inability to think something doesn't show, I guess, that it couldn't be true. But I think that the physical resources are sufficient to deliver the consciousness which is absent in the case of the zombie. So I have to say that we're somewhat confused in detail when we think about such a case and claim that there's no consciousness present.
Yeah, maybe another way to think about it is that, like, look, maybe we can't rule in or out, like, a priori whether they're the same. But, like, okay, maybe some evidence that they are the same, and so, like, then so much for the whatever pre-theoretic intuitions we had that they came apart or something like that.
Yeah, I think I agree we can't rule it out a priori. And I also think, we've generally, over the last 30, 50 years in philosophy, come to accept that there might be necessities that are a posteriori. And this might be an analogous sort of a case.
Yeah, and especially that wouldn't be so surprising if we have sort of conceptually distinct ways of talking about the same stuff in principle.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And there's other cases where people would agree. I mean, maybe someone like Chalmers or someone would say that, well, but those other cases, like with water or heat or something, those are disanalogous in other ways because it's not positively, ideally conceivable that they come or whatever. Right. But anyway, that's to go into more details of the dialectic there. But
yeah, and I actually agree with David Chalmers about many of the cases. I don't agree about this particular case. I think it's a somewhat disanalogous case. But yeah, we have lots of experience thinking about posteriori necessities, and that should at least soften us up, I think, to entertain this possibility in this case as well.
Right. Okay, so let's see. I did want to. You brought up the color experience and colors a bit already, but maybe if we focus on that a bit more, like how does your approach, the MOUDD approach, apply to thinking about color vision experience?
Okay, so there's basically two elements of the account that are developed in the book. One is the nature of the colors that we experience as we experience them, and the other has to do with their spatial position as we experience it. And the basic idea is that to experience a color as at a certain apparent location requires the formulation of a certain kind of modal filament, a certain element of the neurophysiology that isn't located at one place in the brain, but links together, involves various elements spread around the brain. And what makes it a modal filament is that there are various alternatives to it at each point along its, so to speak, location as its path through the mind. And I think I've talked a little bit about how the experience of the particular color is supposed to come about. The eye and the neurophysiology of vision that is behind the eye is organized in this sort of opponent way. So there are systems responsive to stimulation in the eye as in opposition blue or yellow, and in opposition red or green. And when those systems are responsive to a certain kind of balance in the stimulus, then we have experience of a particular color. So if we have experience of orange when the red green system is tipped toward red and the yellow blue system is tipped toward yellow. We have experience of green when the red green system is tipped toward green, and so forth. And so that's a sort of fundamental element present in the nature of any particular minimal experience of color. Like, you can think of it as a single color quale. But there's also the spatial aspect of it, of our visual experience, and I think that involves, as old cases involving inverting glasses show, that there be a certain kind of structure involving not just the stimulation that involving the neurophysiology of color vision, but also the ways we respond to that spatially. There are inverting glasses which you can purchase or make and put on, which make everything look upside down. And when you put these on and wear them for a while, obviously your spatial sense becomes confused. Your visual spatial sense becomes confused. But if you wear them long enough, you adapt, especially if you do activities of different kinds, all kinds of different sorts. And the world no longer seems upside down. And it seems to me that what that indicates is that, or I argue in the book that one thing that indicates is that these sort of modal filaments, usually necessary to constitute our experience of a color at a particular visual location, are broken up when we first they're disrupted when we put the glasses on. And then they reform over time and they reestablish themselves. So I think that some features of our vision are constituted, especially in regards to spatial structure, in ways that don't have much to do with what happens on the retina. It has to do with other aspects of what's going on in our brain. Another kind of example is there's neural structure in the V1 area behind, sort of at the back of the head, where there seem to be neurons that are organized systematically to be responsive to lines that are in various orientations systematically, like this way, this way, this way, and this way. And I think that stiffens up our experience of the spatial array of colors that we might see in the world, so that it has such things as straight lines in it. And there are facts about which of the colored qualia are seen as in a line. So it seems to me there's a complex set of different aspects of our neurophysiology that are relevant to our color experience when you look at all its details. Is that the sort of thing you had in mind?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we don't need to get into any of the specific neural structures or anything that are involved. But in principle, you think that some story like that could be given, even if we don't know. Obviously, we don't know all the details now, but
we know more details in vision than anywhere else, and in other senses, there's been progress, but it's slow.
Right. And so another thing having to do with color experience, I mean, you sort of mentioned a few times already that, like, you reject this sort of almost like Aristotelian view that colors are sort of out there, like spread over the surfaces of objects or something like that. Or even that they're like representations of surface reflective properties or something like that.
Right.
I was thinking, okay, of course, the experience is something in our heads, so to speak, but we could still think that while the experiences are not out there, there's the objects in the world still could be colored in a sense. Mm-hmm. And maybe that does have something to do with them, what sort of surface reflective properties they have, or what sort of experiences they tend to cause in us under certain conditions or something like that. Right. And maybe we could also say that the colors are like multiply realizable to get around the kind of unique hues problem. And I don't know, I have different things to say about some of this stuff, but I mean, what do you think broadly about this sort of approach?
One thing, I mean, I don't know how carefully I've spoken today, but I try to avoid in the book claiming there are no colors on objects.
Right.
What I try to say is there's no such color exactly as we experience it on the object. So I think there are surface spectral
Right.
reflectances that correspond reasonably well to many of the differences and explain many of the differences in the colors that we see. There are other aspects which the surface spectral reflectances don't capture very well. So I use this jargony term, phenomenal color, for the color as we see it, color as it is exactly in our experience, with all the details of similarity it presents to us. And I don't. There's a question about the semantics of the word red and whether in the world where there's surface spectral reflectances that correspond to many of the features of our intuitive sense of what red is, but where there's some features which are not present in the world. There's a semantic question about whether you want to say there's red or not. Galileo said red is just a word. Colors are just words. I'm not quite prepared to say that, but I do think phenomenal colors, Aristotelian colors, don't live out there on the objects. You could have a view that they did, but I think then it would have a little role in our explanation of our color vision, because our color vision seems our own sensation of the colors seems mediated by light reflected and refracted from the objects, and it seems like the the Aristotelian colors wouldn't be doing any particular job. The other problem with Aristotelian colors is you have to decide whose Aristotelian colors. You can't. I mean, maybe we say color normal humans, which is a bit prideful because animals are different. But even color normal humans, there's differences in their color experience that are subtler, and so it's difficult to see how you could come up with a plausible objective assignment of objective colors, Aristotelian colors, to objects, even if you were prepared to do that. I mean, you could say, one person gets it all exactly right, but I don't know how you determine who that person is.
Well, maybe there's a sort of God's eye view now.
If God sees colors, then that would do it. Do we think God would see colors like ours? Or, I mean, there are other animals as well. And
Yeah.
if God sees colors, whose colors does God see? Not the colors that the colorblind see, but even the issue about unique use means there'd be only a few people, I guess, in accord with the colors that God sees. And it just seems implausible that it would work that way. Maybe God would see radically different colors entirely.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you might want to say something like, okay, we use maybe similar words like red, green, blue, whatever, but what we're picking out or what concepts we have might vary from person to person, or even over time as your color experiences change and you conceptually develop these notions. I mean, I don't know, but maybe that doesn't play well with a view where it's entirely independently of what we're doing conceptually. Like the world is sort of painted over with these colors. That seems a bit strange. Yeah.
Yeah. But there's a view that is held. Yeah.
Right. Let's see. And although we're not going to cover it now, you do go over some other sort of modalities in the book, not to confuse sensory modalities in terms of like sight and hearing and a little bit. But as you say, there's even less understood than color vision. But
there's a fair amount of evidence. There's a fair amount of evidence that objective correlates in the world don't fit very well with our experience in some of the other senses. But obviously the senses are less well understood. One kind of case that does show reason to think not just one aspect of the brain is involved, one like representational region, is the pain case. Because most people recognize that there are nociceptors in the skin that are in the body that are receptive to damage of various kinds. And that seemed to play a crucial role in many forms of physical pain. But there are also motivational aspects of pain, like you want it to stop or you want it to run away from it. And there are cases in people where these two features of our pain experience come apart. So-called morphine pain, where you have the experience, something like the experience of pain, but you don't care. And so there's reason to think both aspects, the sort of quasi-sensory aspect involving the nociceptors and also the more motivational aspects of it, are all involved in normal experiences of physical pain, and they involve different brain regions. So that is another kind of case, somewhat analogous to the case of vision and its location, to show that to motivate the thought that different uh, features spread over the brain are probably relevant to the experience, say, of a quality of pain.
Right. Yeah, that actually reminds me of one thing that I was thinking about when reading it. I mean, you talk, of course, people have often talked about how there's a sort of unity of experience, but at the same time, you want to say that the experience is sort of distributed in this way. There's not the sort of maybe a central meeting point in the brain where the phenomenal consciousness is realized. Might be worried that, well, that doesn't really fit well together, right? You might expect that there would be a sort of central meeting point if there's a sort of unity. How do you get unity from something distributed in this way, if that makes sense?
The idea is the unity of the whole agent. So what unity there is the unity of the entire agent acting as a unified agent. Now, and this, I mean, they're different. This requires that agents be unified in ways, and there are ways in which they are not unified, even in their experience. So there are these cases, for instance, of blind sight, where it would seem as if people who've had forms of neural damage really report they can't see things that are happening in the left hemisphere of their visual field. But yet, if you presented with stimuli in that field, if you force them to choose, they what it is, they choose better than randomly. And so it does seem as if there's registration of information that's present and even affecting action in a way that's not conscious. And that's at some apparent tension with my view that the whole brain, the whole nervous system is the seat of consciousness. And the way I deal with those objections, rooted in the natural objections to that whole nervous system model, for instance, that we have features, we have unconscious perceptions or features of our beliefs that are unconscious at the time, and so forth. There's a series of different relatively complex responses I use to develop answers to those questions. But what I claim is our actual, what it's like consciousness is more complex in some ways than maybe generally recognized. There's now a dispute that's playing a role in philosophy between people who think our sensory experience is relatively limited to just the traditional sensory properties like colors and shapes, and those who think it's richer in certain ways, so that in our phenomenal consciousness, or what it's like, things appear as trees, for instance, as opposed to just arrangements of shapes. And so there's an aspect of the view that I develop which embraces that. But also, so there's a form of what I call hyper experience, which is complicated structurally in certain ways, so that we have some awareness even of the back sides of objects that we're looking at, I think. And that we can, in the case of color, for instance, that we're looking at orange, there's a sense in which we can sort of see through to yellow, the pure light yellow that's a part of it. That may be a more difficult or controversial or plausible case. But I think consciousness is actually richer in those ways. Our conscious sensory or perceptual experience is richer in those ways. So that's one aspect of it. But I also think that there are probably forms of experience, even conscious experience, outside of our central hyper experience that may be present in cases like blind sight. And so I don't think if you have blind sight of color stimuli, apparently you're reacting to the same sort of sensory what it's like that's present in our conscious experience. So our choice in that case is between saying they're unconscious uh, sensory qualia, which sounds difficult, and saying no, the sensory qualia are present in that case, but they're in a different, lesser form. Maybe other animals who are somewhat different from us have also analogously different forms of phenomenal consciousness. But so there are ways to try to handle the cases where there seem to be a lack of unity involving these complexities in the nature of our consciousness, allowing different forms and degrees of it, for instance.
Yeah, good. So a couple sort of related things. I mean, you mentioned uh, unconscious stuff there. I mean, of course, you focus primarily on phenomenal, like conscious phenomenal states, but in the book you also a little bit discuss like unconscious mental states, like
Yes.
standing beliefs and so on.
Yes.
Would you have to add something into your approach? Like, how does your approach apply to
Like
that?
standing beliefs. I mean, they're different.
Yeah.
One way to handle so the basic treatment of standing beliefs goes like this. Um, some standing beliefs enrich your actual experience. So you believe that such and such a thing is a cow. If the fact that it's a cow is present in your experience of the cow in this rich way that I adopt from other people, then that's one way in which the belief is present in your consciousness, and hence is the neural resources that underlie it are plausibly relevant to your consciousness. But the other main element in that response is to say, um, obviously, if we were to have different sensory stimulations, we'd have different sorts of conscious sensory experiences. And so I think part of the way in which our differences in belief are present in our neurophysiology are available in that sensory conscious experience under hypothetical conditions of stimulation. And so those are the two main resources that I use: enriching the content of the conscious experience to handle some cases, and then in other cases saying, well, obviously, if you have beliefs about your car and your car is not present in your experience at present, it's unlikely to infect your experience. Well, but it would if you were to be sensory stimulated in other ways. There are other aspects of belief. I think a lot of our belief is mediated by language when we speak to ourselves and say things, and so there has to be an account of how language as we speak it to ourselves is in a way present concretely to us, and it carries certain sorts of content in ways that are very hard to understand. But so there's a variety of different resources like that you can use to try to distribute issues about what beliefs are in such a way as not to conflict with a so-called whole nervous system model of what constitutes our consciousness.
All right. Yeah, and definitely that could be explored further in the other
Yeah.
sorts of subconscious stuff as well.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, very complicated issue, which is not fully explored in the book.
Right. I did want to ask also briefly about, I mean, you talked a lot about about humans and other animals and so on, but I mean, do you have any suspicions about what sort of other creatures? I mean, does it have to be animals like that could be conscious? What do you think?
I don't want to rule out. I think, in my view, we're very similar to some other animals in ways we can have strong reason to think suffice for something quite like what it's like in sensory experience. I mean, some people say only animals capable of language actually have a relevant one. I don't think that's at all plausible. So I do think the view doesn't imply anything about the other cases, but I think it naturally fits with the view that at least other animals with nervous systems that are unified in the ways ours are probably have some form of phenomenal experience, some sort of what it's like experience. Now, if you move to non-living agents, uh, agents constituted out of some sort of information processing structure, but which act like we do, my instinct is to say that they're somewhat analogous to us, but we don't know, the depth of the analogy and how much of it. So in a way, it's almost like I'm saying, it's the claim that something has this sort of what it's like phenomenal consciousness. Even in our own case, in the case of blind sight, it's sort of there are matters of degree and different forms of it. Probably the word applies into other cases beyond our own, even to robots of the right kind, but in a different. They're more peripheral cases. The word is sort of understood centrally by our own case, and then there's an issue about how far its reference extends out to different cases. There's not going to be a natural kind that corresponds, I think, to um, phenomenal consciousness. There's going to be different things that have it to one degree or another. Some people think plants, maybe that was the case you were thinking of, are conscious in some sense. They don't have nervous systems, but they have things that are analogous in some ways to nervous systems. And I think what I want to say is, well, yeah, maybe they have something analogous to what we have. Maybe all living things do, but I don't know if the analogy is close enough for it to be plausibly modeled on the basis of our own central sort of phenomenal consciousness, the kind that we really centrally understand. So I think the real answer is I don't know. I don't know. But I don't think the view implies that it's impossible.
No, that's very fair. I did want to ask, because you talked a little bit about it coming in, or potentially coming in degrees. Like, do you think there can be sort of vague or even indeterminate cases, like
Yes, I
of
think so.
conscious? Like, yeah.
Yes, I do. I actually think there. I think there are. I think it could. I think there are degrees of presence and different forms of presence, even in the sort of central case of what I call hyper experience. And I think there are uh, different degrees in which even hyper experience could be present. And then it may be that we're going to shade off. I think in our own case, at least the book implies in our own case, that there aren't any cases of indeterminacy of whether something has phenomenal consciousness or not. But I think if we move out to other sorts of entities which are analogous to in different ways, that could easily be the case. They're just too unlike the case we know.
Right. All right. And I mean, I guess it's also sort of related, but I mean, what do you think about like functionalist approaches? And do you think, like, to what degree do you think there's a sort of substrate dependence?
Yeah, I think, well, let me answer in two parts. I think that because in functionalism, all the states are related at a single level. So there are causal relations amongst states at one level, and they have roles at the single level. And I think neurophysiologically, if we take seriously the form of neurophysiology we have, it has to be more complicated than that. There have to be crucial effects at one level affecting things that happen below and above and so forth. Now, the second part of the question has to do with the relation of that issue to the consciousness issue, and the issue about what level of detail, what level of physical detail is essential. And the answer is I don't know. In principle, I am prepared to go all the way down to the physical details of the neurons, but I don't really think that's necessary. I think it's unlikely that a consciousness exactly like our own could be constituted out of non-living cells. We may have test cases available to us, the use of artificial ear implants that, my view, would imply certain things about the biological relevance of the sensory receptors, which, if they're no longer biological, would allow us to assess perhaps what level of detail is really crucial. But I have a feeling that my guess is that a fairly low level of neurodetail is relevant, but not all the way down to the physical details of what happens in each little tiny uh, transition in a neuron.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I don't know. Like, what do you think about just like a silicon-based life form? Is that
Yeah,
like,
space life form would be another. I mean, I don't want to rule out silicon-based life forms. And if they could have neural-like structures, but they were brewed in a different kind of chemical basis. I don't know. I suspect that their sensory consciousness would have to be somewhat different from ours. That the chemical details may matter, but I don't know that for sure. And there's nothing in the book that requires that. There's just a question about what is the level of the neural structure, what is the level of detail of the modal structure that's required, and I don't know. I know we can go deep enough to find the obvious structural features of our color vision without going down to the chemical details. But you've raised issues about inverts, and it may be that we have to go fairly deep to rule out the real possibility of inversion. And if that's true, it might be that silicon-based life, though it could be conscious, would have a different form of consciousness than our own.
right? But what about something a bit more different? I mean, like artificial intelligence. Like,
yeah, I think if you're talking about large language models, I think no, I don't see. But there might be a form of embodied artificial intelligence that had a kind of, it had motor capacities and it had sensory capacities of more ordinary sorts that would, I think, possibly be capable of something like consciousness. I wouldn't want to rule that out.
right. And then before we wrap up, I did talk a few months ago with Paul Thagard, and he had a book earlier this year called Dreams, Jokes, and Songs, How Brains Build Consciousness. And I'm not going to get too much into details here, but he argued there that for a specific sort of physicalist approach where there's certain kind of neural mechanisms, or mechanisms generally, maybe they don't have to be neural in principle, that were sufficient for consciousness. And that was like neural representation, and we call binding, coherence, and competition. Now, I didn't build anything specifically modal into that, I guess, explicitly, but I don't know. What do you think about, at least broadly, that sort of approach?
I think of it as in the representation-based, information-based tradition, and I don't want to. I think that because that's the dominant model across neuropsychology, cognitive science, and so forth, I think we've discovered a lot about the brain that's quite relevant to the issues we're talking about. Competition, for instance, neural competition, I think is real, and so I think that is relevant. I'm skeptical that it helps much with the issue of sensory qualia, just because I think because there's a mismatch between colors as we experience them, for instance, and features out in the world like surface spectral reflectances. I don't see how those stories can deliver the features of our sensory qualia that seem to be present in them. If they could, then I would be very much more sympathetic to them. I think actually the binding problem is an interesting aspect of this difficulty that they have. Essentially, the idea is you can find areas in the brain that resonate to color, red, and fire when something's red, and you find another region in the brain that resonates and hence may be said to carry the information when you've got a car. But there are two different areas of the brain. And so you have a binding problem. You have to explain how you have a visual experience of a red car. And you do that by coming up with, in the tradition of Van Treisman, some story about what binds these separate representations. Maybe you look for some temporal pattern of oscillation or something of that nature. And it seems to me that, when dualists have trouble understanding how, physical structures could give rise to experience of color, they should also have trouble about how it is that somehow this co-oscillation of different representational elements in the brain could give rise to a unified experience of a color. What I want to say is somehow the modal structure of the neurophysiology must deliver that unity. And it can't be constituted out of distinct representations in the way the representational correlation tradition seems to be forced to do. What they should be, it seems like what they really need is one like neuron responding to red car, but they don't have it. So they look for these other ways to eliminate that problem. So, maybe they'll work it all out. And it is the dominant tradition, and it's achieved quite a bit. But I'm skeptical that they're going to succeed. And so what I'd like to do is to come up with a way to think of all the experiments and that they use in support of their view, and think of them in a different way and not throw them out. And I think that the modal structural way of thinking of the experiments might provide that way of thinking of their experiments, of the experiments that they cite, which gives them the proper interpretation to be useful.
Yeah, that's good. Actually, I was going to ask, like, how do you think we could make progress here? Like, what sort of further research, investigation, or just thinking about these issues would be?
I feel like we are making progress, but we may be thinking about our progress in the wrong way. That we have the wrong conceptual tools to look at the experimental results in the way that we should. No doubt that affects the experiments that are done in some ways, and so maybe there are some. We're lacking some results, or we're having some results that are irrelevant. We're lacking some results that we should be looking for. But I do think, I feel like there's a conceptual problem in cognitive science and neuropsychology about how people are thinking about the results that they're developing. And one would like to develop an alternative schema that would allow them to think of those results in a different way. And I would love it if the modal structural way would be a way to do that, but I can't say that I have developed it in a sufficient way to deliver that.
Right, fair enough. But yeah, let's see. I think it's been really great having you. I do want to wrap up with a kind of general metaphilosophical question, if that's all right. Sure. What do you think is the value of philosophy? Like, why do you think philosophy is worth doing? I know it's a broad question, but maybe get some thoughts on that.
I think philosophy, even though philosophers have become, because of professional reasons, more specialized over time, I think we have an opportunity to look at things together in a way that some professional academics do not. And I think that's a value. I think we have certain kind of conceptual tools and abilities that we develop that are useful in interaction with other intellectual disciplines. So I think that it's valuable, especially in the pressure, in the face of the pressures for extreme specialization that are occurring in our intellectual life. We are facing it ourselves in our own discipline, but I think we still have enough flexibility that we can perform a useful role. So I think it's very valuable. I think that we have ways, we've developed through our history ways of thinking of issues that are very helpful and informative in helping other people think about their own work and its place in the larger scheme of things.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I like that. Yeah. So, all the questions are closed there. But thanks so much for coming on, Professor Mendola, and taking my questions. And it's been really great. It's been really great having you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it very much.